Hi there, this is David and welcome to Gaming History. Today we're going to be talking about Lufia and the Fortress of Doom. RPGs were extremely difficult to come by in the early 90s, and gamers were eager to get their hands on whatever that they could find. There was pretty much only 5 major RPG releases on the NES, so it's no wonder they weren't that popular in the West. No one knew that they existed. There weren't many signs that the sad state of affairs was going to change anytime soon, and the outlook was bleak. Enix even went as far as closing down their American offices. But Square held out and pretty much single-handedly delivered RPGs for the West. In 1991, they released Final Fantasy IV, or 2 in the States, and to the surprise of many, it was pretty popular. Square would go on to release a succession of quality RPGs for the SNES, but there were some other companies that wanted to try their hand at matching the success of Final Fantasy in both the East and the West. One such company was Neverland, with their release of Lufia and the Fortress of Doom. Lufia is their debut title, and unfortunately, it shows. It's pretty much a straight Dragon Quest clone, but with a few Final Fantasy elements thrown in for good measure. For instance, magic elemental damage actually affects monsters differently based upon their weaknesses, and you can see your characters in battle, although not in a side view format like Final Fantasy. The battles still take place in first-person view a la Dragon Quest, and the player simply watches the backs of the characters attack the monsters. Encounters are random, which is par the course for the time, and the characters gain magic spells upon leveling up, like most Dragon Quest games and Final Fantasy IV. There are the 4 Fiends, or Sinistrals in this case, whose names are a direct rip-off of the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse in Revelation. The series had moderate success and had 3 follow-up titles, a prequel on the SNES, Lufia 2 Rise of the Sinistrals, a sequel on the Game Boy Color, Lufia The Legend Returns, and a side story spin-off for the Game Boy Advance, Lufia, The Ruins of Lore. 7 long years after the last installment, the series received new life with the DS release of Lufia, Curse of the Sinistrals, an action RPG telling a much different version of Lufia 2's events. In Japan, the series is known as Estepalis Denki, or Record of Estepalis. In North America, the series got its name from one of the main characters in the first game, and even though Lufia herself is absent from all successive games, the title stuck. The Sinistrals, or Mad Gods in Japan, I previously mentioned, are also consistent throughout the series as the main antagonists. Lufia is pretty unique among console RPGs in that it is a sequel to a, then unmade, game. The game opens 100 years in the past with the band of heroes from Lufia 2 fighting the Sinistrals. Maxim and his band of heroes, Selen, Guy, and Artea, handily defeat the Mad Gods, and the ending sequence of Lufia 2 begins. It's at this point where the game fast-forwards 100 years into the future, and the player finds that Maxim's sacrifice is in vain. The Sinistrals are reviving, and it's up to a new band of heroes to defeat them. The hero, whom you name, is a pretty typical protagonist with bright red hair. He is not, however, a silent protagonist. He will converse with other party members and with NPCs at various points in the game. He is one of the 2 most powerful melee fighters in the party, and is also capable of casting healing magic. He's also the descendant of Maxim and Selen. Lufia is the main character's childhood friend and his love interest. Lufia is the most powerful spellcaster in the game, particularly whenever it comes to offensive and buffing and debuffing spells, making her the default spellcaster. Personality-wise, she's pretty feisty, but she has a crush on the hero. Aguro is a knight in the Lord Benian army, and the only party member who cannot cast spells, so as such, he's a stronger melee fighter than the main character. He considers himself a noble figure, though he's not above bickering with Jaren like they're an old married couple. The final party member, Jaren, is a half-elven girl who the party rescues from being sacrificed to monsters. She joins the party and, well, not as powerful as the guys. Her bows hit groups of enemies, greatly reducing grinding time. While she's not as powerful a spellcaster as Lufia, Jaren gains healing spells more quickly and is the only party member who can cast the Raise spell, making her the ideal dedicated healer for the party. The battle system is standard JRPG affair with random encounters, elemental spells, heals, buffs, and debuffs. However, the characters do have a lot of spell overlaps, especially whenever it comes to the healing spells. But that humdrum system is not the worst of it. It is one huge, glaring flaw that I've yet to mention. A problem that should have been left behind in the 8-bit era, an unforgivable targeting situation. If the player targets the same enemy with 2 characters and the first character kills it, the second will just whiff at the air rather than target the next enemy in line. This is extremely annoying and downright game-breaking in such a grind-heavy game. As far as I know, this is the only 16-bit game with this problem. Characters have a rigid level progression path with no choices of what powers they gain, what attribute bonuses they get, or anything else. Instead, any customization of your party members is done through items. Aside from standard weapons and armor, there are accessories that can provide an attribute boost, increase the power of certain spells, or increase damage against certain kinds of enemies. There's also expendable items that will permanently boost one of their attributes. There's also an optional side quest involving collecting dragon eggs, which are scattered around the world, and exchanging those will grant you extra bonuses. Graphically, the game looks pretty bland. There are very few different tile sets for the various dungeons and cities, so one dungeon could be pretty much visually identical in terms of tiles and colors to the next dungeon. Lufia has an interesting setup, but it lacks the niceties of the later 16-bit RPGs. There's very little in the way of character customization, and there's also way too much tedious grinding. And it doesn't quite possess the drama or the charm of a Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest game. Thankfully, the later titles build off this title and offer substantial improvements. The US version of the game is fairly close to the Japanese version, aside from suffering from the standard Nintendo of America policies regarding uses of crosses in temples. Additionally, in the Japanese version, you could press the X button to get a brief description of an item, but this feature was removed from the English release. In 1994, Taito announced that Lufia was going to be ported to the Genesis, and he put advertisements in magazines, though without screenshots. The only time that the game was publicly displayed was at a CES trade show, where some very incomplete footage was shown. In 1995, the game was quietly canceled. Development had been outsourced to an American company named Technocrest, and was given an extremely tight deadline to be finished. In the end, the developers strung Taito along and barely worked on it, creating only a few demos. A ROM was released showing off the title screen and a small dungeon to walk around. The visuals are essentially identical to the SNES release. In 2009, Taito ported Lufia to mobile phones in Japan. Other than some new supplemental artwork, the game uses the same graphics. The game's received mixed to positive reviews on its initial release. Electronic Games scored at 93%, calling it the best RPG of the year so far. Lufia was a good game for its time. I played it myself back then, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, but it's really aged terribly. I would say to play it only if you love the Lufia series and you want to see where it all began, as well as become more exposed to the game's lore, history, and world. Although, truthfully, there isn't all that much of that to go around. This has been David with Lufia, A History. If you like this, please like, comment, and subscribe. And be sure to check out some of my other videos, including Breath of Fire, A History. Have a good day.